Shabbat Shalom to everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the history of the Haggadah, very briefly, but I want you to think for a minute and answer me the question, how many of you used the Manischewitz Haggadah growing up? Raise your hand if you used the Manischewitz Haggadah growing up. How many of you, when you close your eyes and you think about the Seder, picture yourself holding still the Manischewitz Haggadah? Now, be honest with me, how many of you, when you think about the Jews leaving Egypt 3,000 years ago, imagine Moses and Aaron sitting there holding the Manischewitz Haggadah? So, of course, you know that's a little silly, and we know that Jewish history changes tremendously. When we say Mani Shtana Halayla Hazeh, how different this night is, we're telling the truth. The way we do things today is very different than the way things were done in the past. And of course, the Manischewitz Haggadah is just one example of how much things have changed, not just over the course of 3,000 years of Jewish history, but really even in the last 30, 20, and even 10 years, change can be extremely rapid. Now, the study of the Haggadah, particularly the book of the Haggadah, which we're going to talk a little bit about this morning, is very interesting because it helps us trace who we are as Jews, where we've been, where we've lived throughout the world, and the development of both our culture and really human culture. So I want to trace for you today, in broad terms, what I see as 5 stages in the history of Pesach, and specifically in the history of the Haggadah, which I think help us as Jews understand where we come from and how we got to be where we are today. So the first period, the truth is I could have asked, maybe it might have embarrassed her a little bit, Eliana, to speak a little bit of this about it today because she read so beautifully in the Maftir. The first period is, of course, the period when we still had a temple. And the main part of Pesach was, of course, the Pesach sacrifice, the Pesach lamb. There may have been other elements that were important in the observance of Pesach, specifically the first night. We know that they ate matzah, although I might point out that the matzah that they ate not all that long ago even was not so different probably than the bread that they ate. It was just maybe cooked a little bit quicker. If you've been to Israel and you have a lafa, very flat pita, really their matzah in the ancient world probably was not all that different. So matzah was really not such a special thing. It was maybe a little different. We know from other sources what did they do in Pesach, specifically on the first night. We know they drank wine. Why did people drink wine back then? Right? Well, wine tastes good. Makes you happy when you drink wine. Right? So they drank wine. We know they sang. They probably sang the Hallel. But really, as far as a ritual, right, the only thing they really had was the Pesach sacrifice. There was none of the things, this is talking about the period that ended in the year 70 CE, none of the things that we're used to that really make our Seder into what it is existed before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. That includes an ordered meal. That includes a ritual recitation of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. It includes the questions. In other words, all of the things that are familiar to us and that are the hallmark of a Seder did not exist when the temple still stood. So probably the second period is probably one of the greatest changes in general in Jewish history, and something I don't think we always recognize enough, that the Jews that we are today were founded and formed really after the destruction of the temple. The crisis, it's hard for us even to appreciate what an incredible crisis this must have been, because the central aspect of Judaism, the number 1 through 10 ways in which Judaism was celebrated in the ancient period, was destroyed in 1 year. And the rabbis who inherited that Judaism had to find replacements for those loss of the temple and the sacrifice. And the 2 main aspects of replacement that they found are still what really defines us as Jews today. And that's prayer in the Beit Knesset, in the synagogue, and that's study in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall. So when it comes to the Pesach sacrifice, what particular things did the rabbis find to replace our inability to serve in the temple? And those are the 2 aspects that we still observe today as well. The first is what I would call is the Seder. Now, what is a Seder? What makes a Seder different from a nice formal meal? Well, the Seder is our version of what we call the Greek and Roman symposium, a formal banquet with a ritual structure to how you eat. Right? What makes a Seder ordered? We know we have times when we have to wash our hands. We have blessings that we have to recite in a specific order. We have foods. You don't just eat whenever you want. You have to eat certain foods at certain times. You have to say certain things at certain times. You eat reclining, or we try to eat reclining in a formal way. And most importantly, there's a prescribed questions and answers. And that's really what the Seder has become. And that brings me to the second part of Pesach, which is the Haggadah. And what is the Haggadah? At this period, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but at this period it's not yet a book. I'm going to get to this in a minute, but there were no books back then. What is the Haggadah? The Haggadah is a ritual discussion of something. Now, originally, very interesting, Rabbi said, let's get together and let's talk about the sacrifice. Right? We can't offer a sacrifice in Jerusalem. Jerusalem no longer stood, at least as a Jewish city. So what can we do? We can talk about the sacrifice. But very quickly, this is in the period of, let's say, 100 to 200 CE, the rabbis made a very, very important decision, and that was to change the topic from sacrifice to story. And story, they moved it from the Beit Midrash, the study hall, where a bunch of rabbis would gather together and discuss the sacrifice, to the home, where parents and children could gather together and tell the tale of how their ancestors left Egypt. And that, I think, is something that really we should appreciate how important that was. Because sacrifice is very technical. There are a lot of details. We read about them in the Torah today. It's in the subject. It's very obscure, very hard for people to connect to. But the story of the Exodus from Egypt is probably one of the greatest stories in the history of humanity. And it's something that's captured our hearts. The evidence is that we still do this 2,000 years ago today. The third stage, that was the second stage. The second stage was immediately following the destruction of the temple. The third stage is when the Haggadah began to be written down. Now, as I said a minute ago, in ancient times there were no books in Judaism except for the Torah, the Tanakh, the Bible. Nothing else that we have written, all of the books that fill our libraries, none of them were written. They were all oral Torah, passed orally from one person to another. And around the 8th or 9th century, Jews began to write down some of this literature, and it includes the Seder and the Haggadah. Now, why did Jews begin to write some of these texts down? Well, if you know a little bit about Jewish history, that's the period in which we began to spread around the world. Specifically, before then, Jews were living in the land of Israel and in Babylonia. And from the 8th to the about 11th or 12th century, they quickly spread, first to northern Africa, to places such as Morocco, Tunisia, and very quickly to Spain, and then eventually to the Ashkenazi, the German lands, traveling up through Italy, eventually reaching France and Germany, the northern lands. And when Jews traveled, they needed to bring things with them. They needed to bring their tradition with them. So what did they do? They began to write down the Haggadah, and this had a tremendous effect on our observance of the Seder. First of all, things begin to become standardized as opposed to just more of a free recitation. You now have a book that you can bring with you and you recite the same thing year after year. The second one is something that we're still living with the consequences today. Once you have something written down, it can get a little longer. So sorry about that, but when it was an oral tradition, you had to memorize everything. How much can you memorize? Once you start writing things down, things tend to get a little bit longer. That's the third stage, the beginning of the writing down. Now, the fourth stage is connected to what's probably, the Atlantic magazine called this, the most important invention in the history of humanity since the wheel. What's the most important invention since the wheel? The printing press, right. The printing press left its mark on every single aspect of civilization, on the structure of our society, on education, literacy, language, politics, you name it. The printing press impacted human history. And it impacted our observance as well. Because what happened, instead of these very expensive books that only a few people could have, you now had the mass production of both the Seder, the Chumash, the Bible, and the Haggadah. It's really hard to imagine. I mean, imagine what it was like when only a few people in an entire city would have had a book. You would have come to the synagogue, even though books existed. How many people had such things? They were expensive, handwritten. You came to the synagogue, you sang along with the chazan, with the rabbi. You sang along, but you didn't have your own book. The same thing with the Seder. You didn't come to a Seder and gather with a Haggadah because only very rich people could afford such a book. The printing press allowed for most people to have a book. Now, I trace this period, this fourth period, until around the 1960s. And through, even when I was growing up, I was born in 1970, we still used the Manischewitz Haggadah, and most people at our Seder all used the same Haggadah. Right? You're probably familiar with that. You had, 15, 20, 25 people at the Seder, everybody gathered together, everybody had the same Haggadah, no one was getting lost from one page to the other. There were different commentaries, but they were all mass-produced very much the same. By the way, another thing, something to think about is the Manischewitz, another revolution that Manischewitz led is, of course, the matzahs. They were the first to mass-produce matzah, but I'm not going to go into that today. If you want, I can come back some other time and give you the history of matzah. In the 1960s, things began to change, and I think that's the era in which we live today. The 1960s in general culture in America was the age of individualism. The age when we wanted to celebrate not how much we're all the same, but how unique each and every individual is. And the Haggadah, much more so than the Seder or the Chumash, the Haggadah became an expression of how different groups observe Judaism. So you begin to get not just the Reform, the Conservative, and the Reconstructionist Haggadah, but you get Haggadot for kids, you get Haggadot for vegetarians, you get Haggadot for feminists, you get Haggadot for communists, you get Haggadot for kibbutznikim, you get Haggadot for people who are intermarried. You have all sorts of Haggadot. I think the bestseller last year, the best-selling Haggadah was the baseball Haggadah last year. The list could go on and on. The Haggadah became a way in which we expressed our individualism. Today, a lot of people come and tell me, I've been teaching this for a long time, every year, Josh, I buy a new Haggadah. No one has ever come and told me every year I buy a new Chumash, or every year I buy a new Seder. They tell me every year I buy some kind of new Haggadah, because we all are looking for something a little bit different. And that's the age in which we live in, is this age of stressing, I still think, our individualism. And I think it's interesting how the number one, I think, manifestation of that is not in the synagogue, but is in the home, specifically on Pesach. So those are the five ages. Maybe in 20 years I can come back and say the internet has created a sixth age. Many people tell me they create their own family Haggadot now. You can go on the web, put in your family pictures, put in your family commentary, and very quickly and easily print up your own Haggadah. I've found over the years of teaching about the Haggadah and about the Seder that people are endlessly fascinated, not just about the essential message of Haggadah, of the freedom, but what interests people a lot about the Haggadah is simply the book itself and the rituals and what we do, how we act at the table. I'm going to talk a little bit about this after lunch as well. And that to me is a message that I'll conclude with overall in Judaism. Judaism is not just a religion about what we think and about what we believe, but Judaism is a religion that shapes our actions, our habits. It's defined by who we eat with, what we eat, who we sleep next to, what we do with our time. The Seder is, I think, the most powerful moment in the Jewish year, not because of the talking and what we say, but it's the most powerful moment because we sit down every year and we have the same foods, and we remember how we ate with our family, and we remember the food that our parents cooked for us when we were children. And we celebrate the food, the order, the way we eat. We joined the Jews throughout history and throughout the world. And it's a very powerful experience. a unifying experience even in a period in which we all use different Haggadot. So I think that I want to conclude here with this today. I'm happy to, after lunch, answer any of your questions about the Haggadah. I want to thank the synagogue, thank United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism for bringing me in this weekend, and thank you all for your hospitality. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.